Introduction: the golden paint over a rotting structure. There are films that move you. There are films that challenge you. And then there are films like Nomadland, films that seduce you. Not with ideas, not with truth, not with emotional honesty, but with atmosphere, with texture, with warm golden light poured generously over human agony. This is a film that does not simply depict suffering. It stylizes it, curates it, polishes it until the viewer forgets what they're actually looking at. A cinematic embalming. A funeral where the corpse is made to look alive. For many critics, this deception was enough. They stood in awe, mesmerized by the film's stillness, whispering words like beautiful, poetic, profound. But beauty is not truth. Poetry is not honesty. And slowness on its own is not depth. Nomadland is an illusion. A quiet, hypnotic illusion that hides a violent collapse beneath aesthetic tranquility. Today we strip that illusion bare. Section 1. A film built on the aesthetics of escape. Let's confront the first and most obvious reality about this film. Nothing happens. No narrative escalation. No transformation. No internal arc. No confrontation. No catharsis. No awakening. It is a story without story, disguised as philosophy. The camera floats through deserts, forests, parking lots, small gatherings of van dwellers who smile politely and avoid deeper conversations. The cinematography is beautiful, breathtaking even, but beauty is not meaning. Beauty can be the enemy of meaning when it replaces truth, and that is what Nomadland does. It replaces the violent psychological collapse of its characters with pretty sunsets. It replaces social disintegration with serene landscapes. It replaces despair with the illusion of simplicity. This aesthetic velvet blanket is the film's defining trick, a trick that critics mistook for artistry, because critics, more than anyone, love to feel wise, especially when the wisdom is easy. Nomadland gives them the illusion of insight, without demanding any actual intellectual confrontation. That is not brilliance. That is seduction. And seduction is the lowest form of persuasion. It asks nothing of you but your surrender. Section 2. The false philosophy of the open road. There is a very old myth in American culture, the myth of the wandering individualist, the rugged soul who needs no home, no roots, no obligations, who finds truth in motion, identity in isolation, and wisdom under the open sky. It's the cowboy myth, the frontier myth, the myth of the lone wolf who answers to no one. Nomadland wants desperately to belong to that tradition. It wants Fern to be a modern Thoreau, a desert monk, a prophet of minimalism. But Fern is not free. She is not wise. She is not enlightened. She is not choosing the road as a philosophy of life. She is choosing it because she cannot live anywhere else. This is not transcendence. This is inability, not liberation. Dysfunction. Fern is a woman whose husband is dead, whose town is dead, whose identity is dead, whose emotional resources have been depleted beyond restoration. She is not choosing a new life. She is avoiding the unbearable reality of the one she lost. That avoidance is the true center of the film. But the film refuses to name it. Section 3. The internal collapse the film hides. Fern is emotionally frozen. Not stoic, frozen. Not resilient, numb. There is a difference between silence as wisdom and silence as shutdown. The film leans on that ambiguity and exploits it. Fern's quietness becomes the canvas on which the audience paints their fantasies. She's strong. She's spiritual. She's minimalistic. She's enlightened. No, she's in shock. She's lost the ability to reintegrate into society. She's lost the capacity to belong. She's lost the internal mechanisms required for rebuilding a self. What we see in this film is not a woman becoming free, but a woman dissolving. A slow-motion erasure, a life evaporating without resistance. A person who has lost the desire, the energy, and the belief needed to live in the world of the living. This is the central tragedy of Fern's existence. And Nomadland romanticizes it. Not only romanticizes it, beautifies it. The trauma becomes a silhouette against a sunset. The depression becomes a soft music montage. The collapse becomes a quiet drive through a stunning landscape. This is not truth. This is anesthesia. Section 4. A film terrified of anger. One of the strangest things about Nomadland is how allergic it is to anger. Think about it. Fern has lost everything. Her husband, her home, her community, her identity. The town she lived in was economically murdered by corporate decisions. Her entire life was uprooted without warning, and yet she is never angry. Not once. She never curses the company that abandoned thousands. She never screams at the injustice of it all. She never expresses rage toward the system that erased her future. This is not character depth. This is character sterilization. Fern is not allowed to feel the most natural human emotion in the face of severe loss. Why? Because if Fern became angry, the film's beautiful fantasy would break. She would stop being a monk of the desert and become something inconvenient. A political subject, a victim, a protester, a witness to injustice, a person who demands accountability. And Hollywood does not give Oscars to films that make viewers uncomfortable in that way. Nomadland chooses silence, because silence is safe. Silence is non-threatening. Silence allows the tragedy to exist without requiring anyone to address it. Section 5. The audience that needed to believe the lie. Why did audiences love Nomadland? Because audiences are exhausted. Modern life is relentless. Pressure is constant. The promise of stability has evaporated. People feel overwhelmed, burnt out, stretched thin, when these viewers saw Fern walk away from everything. From bills, from obligations, from the weight of expectation, they felt relieved. Relieved that someone, somewhere, had escaped. It didn't matter that Fern's escape was actually a collapse. It didn't matter that her wandering was a symptom of trauma. It didn't matter that she was running from herself. People saw what they needed to see. A fantasy of freedom, a fantasy of release, a fantasy of disappearing from the world without actually dying. In that sense, Nomadland became a form of emotional pornography, a soothing image of surrender for a culture drowning in the expectations of modernity. And that is precisely why the film is dangerous. Because it encourages viewers to admire what should alarm them, to envy what should frighten them, to romanticize what should be confronted. The audience, desperate for relief, mistook Fern's paralysis for wisdom. Section 6. The Great Insult. When a film uses real suffering as aesthetic material. This film uses real van dwellers, real nomads, real workers destroyed by the American economy, and turns them into decorations. Some appear as themselves. Some tell their true stories. Some share the details of their heartbreak. But the film structures those stories to support a false narrative that these people have chosen this life, that they are content, that they are enlightened, that this collapse is somehow poetic. But these are real people, real wounds, real systemic failures. Not props for a filmmaker's minimalist aesthetic. Using real suffering while refusing to name its cause is not authenticity. It is exploitation. A quiet exploitation. A gentle exploitation, but exploitation nonetheless. Because the truth is simple. The people in this film did not choose the road. The road was the only place left for them. Nomadland does not provide their truth. It erases it. Section 7. What the film refused to show. Here is the list of things the film brave enough to show with immaculate cinematography, but too cowardly to confront. Corporate greed, exploitation of labor, the destruction of small towns, healthcare injustice, predatory capitalism, the emotional cost of economic displacement, the psychological cost of loneliness, the reality of untreated mental illness, the decay of American infrastructure, the collapse of community, the slow death of working-class identity. Nomadland sees all of this, but says nothing. Instead, it whispers, Let's admire the view. And that whisper won Oscars. A Nomadland, The Beautiful Lie. Full critic. Part 2, 2,300 words. The attack deepens. Part 2, a cinematic mirage built on half-truths. Nomadland does not lie by invention. It lies by omission. It crafts an emotional geography so selective, so curated, so carefully edited, that the audience walks away thinking they've seen the whole picture, when in reality they've seen only a fragment. The fragment that hurts the least. Let's expose the half-truths that the film converts into art. Section 1. The politics that vanished into the desert. Nomadland is a political story stripped of politics. A town dies. An industry collapses. Workers are abandoned. Families are uprooted. Lives are shattered. This is not a personal tragedy. This is a systemic one. Yet the film erases the system, as if companies simply evaporate, and economies simply collapse. Because fate has a twisted sense of humor. Where are the boardrooms? Where are the policymakers? Where are the decisions that turned Empire, Nevada into a ghost town? They're nowhere. And that's intentional, because naming the forces responsible would turn the film into something dangerous, something radical, something real. Instead, the film chooses a safer narrative. Town died. People scattered. Life goes on. No, life does not go on. People are crushed by forces beyond their control. And the film refuses to acknowledge those forces. This is not neutrality. This is ideological editing. By refusing to show the machinery of collapse, Nomadland absolves it. It lets the audience believe that this is just how things are. It turns structural violence into fate. It turns corporate abandonment into background texture. It turns economic injustice into scenery. And scenery is not threatening. Scenery asks for nothing. Section 2. The manufacturing of the quiet, passive poor. The poor in this film are impossibly calm. Where is the resentment? Where is the frustration? Where is the fight? Where are the arguments, the anger, the grief that always accompany economic devastation? Nowhere. Everyone smiles with the soft acceptance of monks who have transcended desire. This is not how actual suffering works. This is not how actual poverty looks. This is not how actual displacement feels. People who lose their homes are devastated. People who lose their communities feel uprooted. People who lose their futures feel rage. But in Nomadland, every wound is neatly stitched closed by the magic thread of acceptance. This is a fantasy where the oppressed never protest, never raise their voices, never demand justice, never speak their pain. A fantasy where the broken remain beautifully broken, where the vanquished remain peaceful, where the abandoned remain grateful. This portrayal sanitizes poverty, so viewers don't have to be uncomfortable. It turns the poor into ornamental figures, who decorate the film's spiritual facade. Section 3. Amazon. The uncomfortable truth the film tries to hide. One of the most disturbing sequences in the film is the extended depiction of Fern working at an Amazon warehouse. Not because the film criticizes Amazon, but because it doesn't. Amazon exploitation is one of the clearest symbols of modern labor injustice. Backbreaking shifts, exhausting hours, low pay, high injury rates, zero long-term security, surveillance-level monitoring. This is the dark heart of American capitalism. And what does Nomadland do? It shows Fern scanning boxes, under bright, clean lighting, with gentle music in the background, like it's a hobby, or a quirky side quest. In a whimsical video game, the exploitation becomes adorable, the monotony becomes meditative, the dehumanization becomes somehow cozy. This is not criticism. This is normalization. This is cinematic laundering of corporate cruelty. The message becomes, it's fine. Look, Fern is smiling. It's not so bad. It's just life, and she's grateful to have a job. This scene should have been the film's eruption point, the moment the truth becomes unavoidable. Instead, it is played with elegance, patience, and calm. A silence that protects Amazon far more than it protects Fern. This is not art. This is complicity. Section 4. The cult of minimalism as a distraction from broken systems. Minimalism in its pure form, is a philosophy of intentional living, but Nomadland hijacks minimalism and converts it into a coping mechanism for systemic failure. It says, you don't need a house. You don't need stability. You don't need healthcare. You don't need a retirement plan. You don't need roots. You don't need community. This is not minimalism. This is deprivation repackaged as spirituality. Minimalism says, I choose to own less. Nomadland says, I have nothing left, but let's pretend that's a choice. This is the dangerous lie at the core of the film. It reframes necessity as enlightenment. People stripped of their homes become monks of the road. People denied stability become disciples of freedom. People with no future become philosophers of the present moment. A lie wrapped in beauty remains a lie. Section 5. The erasure of the future. Nomadland is terrified of the future. Fern never thinks about it, never plans for it, never dreams about it. She has no vision, no hope, no destiny. The camera shows us endless horizons. But Fern never moves toward anything. She moves away from her past, away from her pain, away from the expectations of society, away from responsibility, away from the version of herself that once believed in life. The future in this film is a blank page that Fern refuses to write on. The tragedy is that the film treats this refusal as liberation. In truth, it is paralysis. The refusal to imagine a future is one of the clearest signs of depression, but the film's gentle aesthetic tells us to admire it. Fern's emptiness becomes purity. Her detachment becomes clarity. Her lack of ambition becomes spiritual insight. This is how despair becomes fashionable. This is how collapse becomes chic. Section 6. Real nomads speak, but the film does not listen. The supporting characters in Nomadland, Swanky, Linda May, Bob Wells, are real nomads, not actors. They tell their real stories. Stories of loss, illness, grief, poverty, displacement, trauma. But these monologues exist, not to reveal truth, but to reinforce the film's aesthetic. Each nomad offers a piece of sadness, but wraps it in acceptance. The editing turns their stories into soft wisdom instead of sharp indictment. Their pain becomes haiku. Their suffering becomes philosophy. Their desperation becomes lifestyle branding. The film treats their stories the way a tourist treats the culture of a country they don't understand. With admiration, but not comprehension. With interest, but not engagement. With awe, but not action. Nomadland listens, but does not hear. Section 7. The silence that shields the audience. The film's greatest weapon is silence. Silence becomes mood. Silence becomes texture. Silence becomes a kind of cinematic hypnosis. But silence can also be avoidance. Silence can be the erasure of complexity. Silence can be the denial of truth. Silence can be the easiest way to avoid responsibility. The film uses silence to let viewers project their own fantasies onto Fern. Viewers can imagine she is free. Viewers can imagine she is wise. Viewers can imagine she is strong, because silence hides the evidence. Silence is a blank canvas on which the audience paints their own meaning. And this is the tragedy. The viewers who praised the film never asked what Fern actually feels. They asked only what Fern symbolizes for them. Section 8. Why the film needed beauty to survive. Nomadland must be beautiful. It has no choice. If the film ever allowed itself to be ugly, emotionally ugly, socially ugly, politically ugly, the illusion would collapse. Beauty becomes the film's armor, its defense mechanism, its way of numbing pain, because beauty can make almost anything tolerable. Even collapse, even despair, even emotional death. Beauty makes the unbearable bearable. That is why the sunsets in this film look like paintings, why the landscapes are framed like postcards, why the sound design is soft, why Fern is always dwarfed by nature, why the pacing is meditative. Beauty in Nomadland is not decoration. It is sedative. A drug administered to the audience, so they don't recognize what they're watching. A story not of survival, but of disappearance. Section 9. The truth the film never wanted to face. And here we reach the most important truth of all. Nomadland is not about freedom. Nomadland is about people who no longer have the capacity to live in society. People who have been broken by grief, by economic collapse, by the death of community, by the weight of a system that does not care about them. People who are not choosing the road, but defaulting to it because every other path has been sealed. The nomads are not rebels. They are refugees. Refugees of capitalism. Refugees of trauma. Refugees of a world that has no use for them. But the film refuses to call them refugees. It prefers the softer, prettier term. Nomads. A word that implies choice. A word that implies adventure. A word that implies romance. But names do not change reality. These are displaced people. And displacement is not a lifestyle. A Nomadland, the beautiful lie. The attack on the institutions that rewarded this illusion. Part 3. The system that crowns collapse as cinema. If Part 1 exposed the illusion, and Part 2 unveiled the half-truths, then Part 3 reveals the machinery behind the illusion. The institutions that celebrated this film, not because it was brave, but because it was comfortable. Make no mistake, Nomadland did not rise on artistic merit alone. It rose because it spoke the language of institutions, the language of gentle despair. Section 1. Why festivals love beautiful suffering. Film festivals claim to reward innovation, courage, and artistic risk. But in reality, they have a weakness, a soft spot for films that portray the suffering of the working class. As long as the suffering is quiet, festivals adore poverty without protest, trauma without anger, despair without confrontation, collapse without consequence, characters who endure rather than resist. This preference reveals a disturbing truth. Festivals love to feel compassionate, without feeling responsible. Nomadland is perfect for them. It lets festival juries gaze upon the ruins of American life and sigh in poetic admiration, while remaining emotionally and politically untouched. The film gives them suffering but aesthetically framed, a poverty but spiritually sanitized, trauma but stylized into softness, economic injustice but without naming culprits, collapse but presented like a dreamscape. This allows festival elites to pretend they are witnessing something profound, without being forced to confront the ugliness of the systems that benefit them. Nomadland is safe suffering, digestible despair, a curated version of collapse that makes privileged viewers feel enlightened. The film is not dangerous. It is harmless, and nothing wins at festivals faster than harmless art dressed as radical commentary. Section 2. The cowardice of the Oscars. Let's talk about the Academy. The Oscars have spent decades rewarding films that appear socially aware, but never threaten the comfort of their members. Nomadland is their ideal scenario. A film about broken Americans that never implicates American power. A film about poverty that never critiques wealth. A film about displacement that never challenges the system that created it. A film about vanishing futures that never asks anyone to change. This is the Academy's favorite formula. Sadness plus beauty plus silence get prestige. Nomadland is the cinematic equivalent of a sorrowful painting in a billionaire's hallway. Emotionally charged, visually artistic, and politically inert. The Academy rewarded Nomadland because it reinforces their worldview. A worldview where suffering is inevitable, where brokenness is poetic, and where responsibility evaporates into tragic fate. Consider the irony. A film about people whose lives were destroyed by the economic structures of America was rewarded by the most elite cultural institution in America. This is not recognition. This is appropriation. The Oscars took the pain of the powerless and turned it into decorative prestige for the powerful. Section 3. Why critics fell in love with a lie. Critics, especially highbrow Western critics, have a predictable vulnerability. They cannot resist the illusion of depth. Give them slow pacing, soft music, long silences, poetic landscapes, a protagonist who says little, themes that are implied, not spoken, and they will declare it profound. They mistake ambiguity for intelligence. They mistake stillness for philosophy. They mistake quiet characters for enlightened ones. They mistake vagueness for universality. Nomadland is engineered for this weakness. It is a buffet of critical catnip. Subtle, minimalistic, poetic, humanistic. Spiritual in its restraint. No, sir, it is evasive in its restraint. It is hollow in its silence. It is shallow in its philosophy. Critics were seduced by the film's refusal to speak. Because if the film never says anything, critics can project anything onto it. Nomadland is like an empty notebook that critics eagerly fill with their own interpretations, and then congratulate themselves for their insight. It is the perfect intellectual mirror, reflecting not reality, but the critic's own fantasy of sophistication. Section 4. The audience that turned passivity into a moral victory. Let's turn now to the viewers. The millions who embraced the film, not because they understood Fern, but because Fern represented their own internal crisis. Modern society is exhausting. Bills, responsibilities, an economy that feels like a trap, a culture obsessed with productivity, a sense of constant failure, a pressure to be strong while feeling broken. Audiences connected to Fern, not because she is complex, but because she is simple. She walks away. She refuses engagement. She refuses the future. She refuses society, and people envied that. Nomadland became a cultural fantasy. What if I could walk away too? What if I didn't have to try anymore? What if I could disappear? What if giving up could look beautiful? This is why the film resonated, not because of truth, but because of the fantasy of escape. Audiences mistook Fern's paralysis for serenity. They mistook her emotional numbness for wisdom. They mistook her inability to rebuild for freedom. This is not empathy. This is projection. And worst of all, they admired collapse, as if collapse were courage. Section 5. Hollywood's desire to feel morally clean. Hollywood likes to see itself as a voice for the marginalized, but it is terrified of giving the marginalized a real voice. Actual working-class rage? Too threatening. Actual political critique? Too risky. Actual systemic analysis? Too confrontational. So Hollywood embraces something safer. The aesthetic of suffering without the consequences of suffering. Nomadland gives them desperation without anger, poverty without politics, loss without accusation, pain without pressure, a broken society without anyone to blame. Hollywood rewards stories like this because they make privilege feel benevolent. The industry can pat itself on the back. Look, we gave an award to a film about poor people. We care. Meanwhile, nothing changes. The system remains intact. The structures that created Fern stay untouched. Hollywood loves a powerless character, as long as the character stays powerless. Nomadland never threatens the balance. Section 6. The theme of escape. That culture is desperate for. This deserves its own section. Modern culture is addicted to escapism. Escaping responsibility. Escaping meaning. Escaping pressure. Escaping the pain of being alive. Nomadland is the ultimate escapist fantasy for adults. A story that says, you don't need to fix anything. You don't need to grow. You don't need to heal. You don't need to belong. You can simply drift. This is not liberation. This is emotional suicide painted as minimalism. No wonder people adored it. The film validates their darkest impulse. To surrender without guilt. To vanish without explanation. To let life become a horizon they never reach. This is why the film won awards. Because the culture itself is collapsing, and wants the collapse to look poetic. Nomadland gives aesthetic justification to a generation secretly fantasizing about disappearing. Section 7. The institutional reward for a film that doesn't resist. Here's the core of the problem. Nomadland is cinema without resistance. No confrontation, no rebellion, no political consciousness, no demand for justice, no claim for dignity. It presents humans crushed by a system, but refuses to challenge the system. This is what made it beloved. Institutions reward films that portray suffering without requesting change. If Nomadland had named the forces responsible, it would not have won awards. If Fern had become angry, it would not have won awards. If the film had asked for justice, it would not have won awards. If the film had dared to expose the savage machinery that produced its characters, it would not have lasted a week in the Oscar race. Nomadland succeeds because it doesn't challenge power. It aestheticizes the consequences of power and frames them as a lifestyle. This is not bravery. This is obedience. Section 8. The worst part. It made defeat look noble. This is the darkest truth of all. Nomadland transforms defeat into dignity. It transforms collapse into philosophy. It transforms paralysis into poetry. It transforms surrender into freedom. It transforms death of community into a mystical horizon. It transforms emotional shutdown into spiritual awakening. This reversal is not just dishonest. It is cruel because real people watch this film. Real people who feel broken. Real people who feel overwhelmed. Real people who feel trapped. And Nomadland whispers to them, you don't have to rise. You don't have to rebuild. You don't have to heal. You don't have to return. You can disappear. And it will be beautiful. This is not art. This is persuasion. A persuasion toward resignation. The film becomes a cinematic sermon for the Church of Collapse, and institutions rewarded it, because collapse, when portrayed beautifully, never threatens the powerful. A Nomadland, the beautiful lie. The final destruction of the illusion. Part 4. The philosophy of vanishing. Why Nomadland is a dangerous film. By now, the cinematic deception of Nomadland is clear. But in the final stretch of our critique, we must go deeper. Beyond cinematography, beyond performance, beyond narrative. We must address the worldview that the film quietly promotes. A worldview that is not merely misleading, but actively harmful. Nomadland is more than a film. It is a philosophy. A quiet, seductive philosophy of disappearing. A philosophy that tells broken people, you do not have to heal. A philosophy that tells traumatized souls, you do not have to face yourself. A philosophy that tells the abandoned, you do not need community. A philosophy that tells the economically destroyed, you do not need justice. A philosophy that tells the exhausted, you can simply drift. And the tragedy is this. Nomadland dresses despair in the clothing of wisdom, like a cult that calls its followers free, but keeps them from ever returning home. Section 1. When a film becomes a soft form of nihilism. Nomadland is often praised for its humanism, but what it actually promotes is a polished, aesthetically pleasing form of nihilism. What is nihilism? The belief that life has no meaning, that suffering has no purpose, that hope is an illusion, that the future is irrelevant. Look carefully. Fern has no purpose. Fern has no goals. Fern has no identity. Fern has no destination. Fern has no long-term plans. Fern avoids relationships. Fern avoids community. Fern avoids responsibility. Fern avoids her past. Fern avoids the future. This is not minimalism. It is nihilism disguised as tranquility. The film presents this hollowing out of the self as a form of enlightenment, as if meaninglessness were a spiritual awakening. But genuine spirituality demands connection, facing truth, growth, transformation. Nomadland offers none of these. Its spirituality is inert, passive, empty, a kind of desert. Zen that allows you to drift without ever confronting the core of your suffering. It is nihilism with a gentle soundtrack. Section 2. The death of community, a cultural warning signal. Humans are social creatures, not by philosophy, by biology. We require community, for identity, for meaning, for sanity, for continuity, for purpose. But Nomadland takes the broken remnants of a community torn apart by corporate abandonment, and reframes their fragmentation as something beautiful. The film says, "Look how peaceful it is when everyone lives alone. Look how spiritual it is when no one belongs anywhere. Look how poetic it is when communities die quietly." But the death of community is not poetic. It is catastrophic. A society without community is a society on the brink of collapse. Fern's wandering is not just a personal tragedy. It is a social one. She is the symbol of a nation whose connective tissue has dissolved, and the film's gentle portrayal hides the magnitude of that loss. Imagine if Fern had stayed in her town. Imagine if the community had rebuilt itself. Imagine if the film had focused on solidarity instead of solitude. Imagine if the story had been about collective resilience instead of individual resignation. Nomadland avoids these possibilities because they require confrontation with reality. It is easier to film one woman drifting than an entire nation rising. Section 3. The vanishing self and psychological avoidance. One of the most dangerous messages in Nomadland is the idea that the self can be healed by removing it from everything that hurts. This is avoidance coping, and avoidance coping kills. Psychology is clear. Avoidance is not healing. Avoidance is fuel for deeper trauma. When people avoid their past, their grief, their relationships, their responsibilities, their identity, their dreams, their own reflection, what happens? Their internal self shrinks. Their emotional resilience collapses. Their ability to form attachment fades. Their identity dissolves. Fern is not becoming more authentic on the road. Fern is becoming less human. Her emotional world is contracting. Her capacity for connection is decreasing. Her internal voice is whispering itself into extinction. And the film presents this shrinking as wisdom. This is why the film is dangerous. It teaches wounded people that shrinking is healing and disappearance is peace. This is the opposite of healing. True healing involves returning, rebuilding, reclaiming, reconnecting, reintegrating, reinventing. Fern does none of these, and the film celebrates that. Section 4. The failure of a nation disguised as a journey. The deeper tragedy is not Fern's collapse, but what her collapse represents on a national scale. Fern is America, or rather, Fern is what happens when America abandons its working class, a nation whose factories die, a nation whose communities wither, a nation whose social fabric disintegrates, a nation whose elderly cannot afford homes, a nation whose sick cannot afford treatment, a nation whose workers cannot retire with dignity. Nomadland is not a story about the American dream. It is a story about the American aftermath. The aftermath of broken promises. The aftermath of corporate greed. The aftermath of political abandonment. The aftermath of capitalism without conscience. But instead of engaging with this reality, the film chooses to marvel at the desert sky. It treats the death of the American worker, the way tourists treat a sunset, with quiet awe and no sense of responsibility. This is not commentary. This is surrender. A surrender so quiet, so gentle, so beautifully shot that audiences mistake it for wisdom. Section 5. The moral danger of beautifying failure. Perhaps the darkest layer of all is this. Nomadland beautifies failure. It beautifies collapse. It beautifies loneliness. It beautifies the inability to cope. It beautifies the death of ambition. It beautifies the dissolution of identity. It beautifies surrender. Consider the ethics of this. If a person is starving, and you paint a beautiful portrait of them, have you honored them? Or have you exploited their suffering as aesthetic material? If a community is dying, and you film it during golden hour, have you documented truth? Or replaced truth with texture? This is the moral question that Nomadland never answers, because it never asks, why is it acceptable to transform the suffering of the powerless into cinematic prestige? For the powerful, why is it acceptable to romanticize the disappearance of human beings? Instead of demanding better futures for them, why is it acceptable to celebrate the aesthetics of collapse instead of confronting collapse itself? This is the cruelty of the film. It does not simply ignore justice. It replaces justice with beauty. Section 6. The film as a roadmap to quiet suicide. You said it yourself earlier. This film is a roadmap for self-destruction, slow, spiritual suicide. And you were not exaggerating. Fern is not surviving life. Fern is withdrawing from it. Bit by bit. Mile by mile. Sunset by sunset. She is not healing. She is fading. Nomadland gives this fading an aura of dignity. It whispers, "You can disappear, and it will be poetic." This is a dangerous message, especially in a world full of people already tempted by the fantasy of vanity. The film tells them, you don't need help. You don't need community. You don't need the world. The horizon will take care of you, but the horizon takes care of no one. This is not philosophy. It is seduction toward nothingness, a cinema of slow erasure, a cinema of gentle death. Section 7. Exposing the root of the illusion. So let us state clearly what Nomadland hides. Fern is traumatized. Fern is emotionally paralyzed. Fern avoids healing. Fern avoids community. Fern avoids responsibility. Fern avoids connection. Fern cannot return to society. Fern is dissolving. The film hides this behind a dreamlike aesthetic. Sunsets, deserts, open roads, warm colors, soft music, quiet dialogue, minimalistic gestures. These aesthetic choices are not neutral. They are concealers. Makeup applied to a corpse. The corpse is Fern's internal world. The corpse is America's broken working class. The corpse is a generation abandoned by society. Nomadland embalms this corpse, instead of resurrecting it. Section 8. The final verdict. Nomadland failed where it mattered most. Let us be brutally clear in our verdict. Nomadland is beautiful cinema and terrible truth. It is visually stunning and morally vacant. It is emotionally seductive and philosophically hollow. It is artistically impressive and intellectually irresponsible. It beautifies what should be confronted. It spiritualizes what should be analyzed. It romanticizes what should be repaired. It aestheticizes what should be politicized. And worst of all, it promotes surrender, as if surrender were wisdom. This is why the film, and the institutions that rewarded it, must be condemned, not because they portray suffering, but because they turn suffering into a lifestyle brand. Not because they show collapse, but because they transform collapse into meaning. Not because they highlight trauma, but because they silence its causes. Nomadland is not a story of human resilience. It is a story of human disappearance, rebranded as enlightenment, and that is unforgivable. Let me leave you with this. Nomadland is a lie, a gentle lie, a beautiful lie, a comforting lie, but a lie nonetheless. It tells you a story about a woman walking toward freedom when she is running away from herself. It tells you a story about a nation embracing the open road when the open road is the only place left to go. It tells you a story about philosophy when the philosophy is simply avoidance. It tells you a story about enlightenment when the enlightenment is emotional numbness. It tells you a story about minimalism when the minimalism is forced by economic abandonment. It tells you a story about community when the community has been destroyed by forces the film will not name. It tells you a story about healing when healing has been replaced by wandering. And then, with a smile, the film hands this beautifully wrapped illusion to the Oscars, to the festivals, to the critics, and they applaud, not because the story is true, but because the story keeps them comfortable. Nomadland is not a mirror. It is anesthesia. It does not ask you to wake up. It asks you to drift, to float, to disappear. But disappearance is not freedom, and drifting is not living, and surrender is not wisdom. Freedom is the courage to face life, not run from it. Wisdom is the courage to rebuild, not dissolve. Healing is the courage to return, not vanish. Nomadland sells us the opposite, and the world rewarded it. So here today, from this studio, on this camera, in this voice, we reject the illusion. We choose truth instead. Truth that demands responsibility. Truth that requires confrontation. Truth that honors the wounded by refusing to romanticize their wounds. Nomadland is a beautiful film, but beauty is not enough. Not when the cost of beauty is the truth. And the truth is simple. This is not a film about freedom. This is a film about surrender. Painted gold. So you mistake it for the sunrise.